Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, it's the second of my conversations with the political philosopher Alan Finlayson, and we're talking about an idea which isn't always necessarily a bad one, but it does seem to go wrong when it falls into the hands of politicians. We're discussing the pitfalls of the idea of modernisation. Alan, the idea we're talking about today is one that gets used in lots and lots of different contexts, and it's not always bad. I think we need to say up front, it really depends on how people are using it. So modernisation can mean lots of different things to different people. But broadly speaking, there are probably two ways in which it gets used. One is to describe a process in social, political evolution, how societies change, possibly how they progress. It may have that built into it. And it tends to be used by academics, not exclusively. The second is more like a political slogan or an exhortation, modernisation with an exclamation mark, something that you should do, you should get on with, and if in doubt, modernise. And I think we're probably going to agree the second one is where the problems are. But a lot of people think there are problems with the first one too. So we should probably rehearse some of those as well and maybe start there. How would you characterise that first use of it? It's not easy to pin it down. But when people talk about modernisation as a social process, what do you think they're talking about?
So I agree with your division of these two ideas, but part of what interests me generally is how academic type concepts reappear in political life. And part of the history of ideas, as you know, is the way in which they get picked and reused up, and bits of them stay and bits of them disappear. And that's part of what I think makes this interesting and important. But to get back to your actual question, what does it mean? I would say, and I think this is probably very broad brush, but not wrong and quite good to understand, that in a way, the concept of modernisation is sort of coterminous with sociology as such, that its founding in the 19th century as a discipline is in part premised, whether they use that concept or not, on an idea that European societies have done something distinct and unique and something of world historical importance. They've become something new and different from other kinds of societies. They've become modern. They've, a more recent term would be detraditionalized. They've stopped doing things just because that's the way they've always done them. And they've begun to do things that appear to be or can be called rationalized, individualized, liberalized, as we might now say. At its founding, sociology is an attempt to understand that. What is it we've actually done? This industrial, capitalist, market, city thing. What is it? How did it happen? Why did it happen here? And what on earth is it doing to us? But that's also not just an academic thing. It is also, I think, reflective of and also creates a certain self-conception of those European societies. Oh, we've done something absolutely that breaks with everything that human beings have done before. So that's really what it's referring to, all those things that we associate with modern life that weren't part of what we imagine to have been early modern or medieval life. Cities and individualization and mass societies and economics and technology. But I think it's worth thinking about the founders of sociology are also thinking modernization in a critical way. That Durkheim, for example, French sociologist, is saying this thing's happened, but it's also left us a bit lacking in meaning and norms and orientation, and we can feel isolated and cut off from society. And Marx is saying, actually, this is bringing in new forms of exploitation and destroying systems of values and creating new illusions. And Weber is saying there's something disenchanting and disturbing about modern life, and we're becoming trapped in our rules and bureaucracies and procedures that we didn't have. But somewhere along the line, the concept seems to me to often lose that critical edge, and it becomes the definition of how you're supposed to be if you're a proper country. You have to have done these things that Europe did in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, however centuries it's argued to be. And if you don't do them, you're becoming wrong. So the self-critique of Western societies turns into a way of critiquing other societies for not having done what we did.
Yeah, you could say it's modernization ? To modernization ! Which is one of the ways it becomes a political slogan. But that 19th century way of understanding that something has happened, it has a history too. It goes back to Enlightenment schemes of human progress and human development. Often the thought was these things go through stages, going all the way back through ultimately feudal, medieval, traditional societies to modern societies. And there are various temptations that come along with that. So one of them is the thought that there are thresholds, and part of the job is to sort of spot the tipping point And certainly that's something contemporary academic writing about this. There's a lot of people who want to know either what the tipping point is or what the key is, which is the switch that gets flipped and then you make the transition. So that's always one of the questions. Another of the questions is there something inexorable about it? Did we do this or did it sort of happen anyway? Is it closer to a natural evolutionary process? And then the third one, where maybe the biggest temptation lies, which is, well, we've done it and now it's up to everyone else to catch up. And there are risks and dangers associated with all of those. So with the first one, I think it's probably fair to say that I don't know if it's a conventional wisdom or a consensus in 21st century academic writing about what happened that turned these medieval societies into modern, industrialized, urbanized, liberalized places, for better or for worse, that the answer is complicated. There isn't a key to it. People really differ. Is it institutions? Is it culture? Is it demography? Is it natural resources? Why does it happen in some places and not in other places? But the temptation is still there. Francis Fukuyama had that question, how do you get to Denmark? Denmark being an exemplar of a place that was pretty miserable and poor and cold and traditional. And it didn't take long to become Lego and smart furniture and liberal values and scoring high on the happiness index. And maybe there's an answer. Maybe you can do it. But I don't think anyone really has plausibly come up with an account where there is a single or even relatively straightforward set of switches that can be flipped. And yet, it's still there, right? I think that temptation, even when you read the academic stuff, it's like, that's the holy grail. Does that come from the 19th century version of it? Or is that more of a contemporary vice that we just think there must be something fundamental that explains this and the other stuff is peripheral?
Yeah, so there's something in there which is a kind of secular theology, isn't there? That there's a place we're supposed to be going. There's a telos, there's an end, and some places seem to be nearer to that end. So we just want to know what's the invocation or the ritual or the thing we have to do to get there. So that's a very appealing, when one might say non-modern idea that is at the heart of modernization, isn't it? But it's also very easy then to begin to use that framework for conscious or unconscious political advantage. Because then what you can begin to say is, well, the thing that I want us to do is the thing we should do, not because I want it, but because it's going to achieve this thing. And we can see that it's just a natural process. And if we do this, we'll really be doing a natural thing. And therefore, there isn't really an argument to be had about it. And that's where I think you get this, if we just have certain kinds of institutions, if we have certain kinds of rule of law and abolish corruption in our economic activity, if we liberate women from the home more, if we do this, if we do that, that becomes the argument. And that's part of why I think it's a bad idea. Not because I'm opposed to those things, but because it becomes a way of thinking about how to get those things that avoids having to really think about how to get those things. It stands in for the hard work of actual political transformation. And I think that's part of its appeal for a certain kind of politician who can then just say, oh, let's make it modern. Stop arguing with me.
It's also true that once it moves from being a complicated term or a term containing all sorts of complicated factors that is used to summarize a long-term historical process and moves to being something that human beings can do and can do for themselves, there is often a default assumption that to modernize is to go with the grain of history. And for whatever reason, to resist that is to try and resist something that will, in the end, sweep you away anyway. And this comes up a lot in lots and lots of different contexts, particularly, I think, in relation to technology and what sometimes now gets called technological determinism, which is a sort of argument along the lines of, you might not like it, but just put that to one side and just reflect on, do you want to spend your time holding up something that's going to get you in the end anyway? Or do you want to join us in moving into the future? And then we can get on with the process of deciding how we want this thing to work. So it becomes an argument, a default argument in favor of going with the flow of things against trying to stand in their way. But that's a big assumption. I mean, there's often quite good reason to not go with the flow of things, actually. It doesn't make you a reactionary. But that seems to be pretty much everywhere when this concept moves from being a descriptive term for a complex process to being a way of saying, this is what we should do. And it's certainly true now, I think. There is a division between people who say, well, you can delay progress if you want to, but in the end, you will have wasted your time, or you can join in and then you'll get your agency back because then you will be going with the flow of history. But you could say, well, it's just simply the wrong way around. If you're going with the flow of history, you've lost your agency. And at least if you're standing there saying stop, you are asserting your agency.
I think that's absolutely right. And that's definitely how it's experienced. It can feel like the modernizer is trying to take your agency from you by saying, look, you've got no choice. Tony Blair once said about globalization that you might as well try and stop the weather. Now, that's potentially a powerful argument, but it's also a deeply disempowering argument. And it's saying, at best, you've got no agency. At worst, you're an idiot who doesn't understand the basic truths about natural processes. And part of the problem is that that's not only going to rob you of agency, because you think you've just got to follow whoever it is that is telling you where the road is that takes you modern, you're also likely, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, to provoke a backlash from people who say, well, hang on a minute, you've been telling me that we have to go down this route and there's no alternative, but it doesn't seem very good to me where we're going. Actually, now I think everything is wrong, not just this, that, or the other. So if you had such a totalizing idea of we have to do everything, it all has to go together, then the opposition to that is going to be totalizing as well and say, well, then let's get rid of the modern. And that's part of where I think we are now in our politics.
Again, just to try to separate out two ways that this can go, there is a familiar critique of the ideology of modernization, which focuses on the ways in which societies that think they have modernized, usually Western European or North American societies, then try and impose that on the rest of the world. So this is a standard part of attacks on colonial arrogance and hubris and projects of democratization, a lot of which come under the heading of modernization. And there is a lot that has been written about the ways in which this so often is crude, aggrandizing politics with so many blind spots, it's almost hard to list them all. And societies that think there is this difference, modernized or not modernized, and that modernization is something that can be imposed, simply trample all over the variety, the nuance, the contingency, the history of the places in which this happened. So that is a standard critique of Western imperial arrogance, and I think it's probably correct. But of course, with all of these things, even the critique, when it becomes just a totalizing thing, misses out all sorts of differences. But the other thing, which I think might be more interesting to talk about, I mean, that one is important too, and we can discuss it. But the other one is what you were just describing there, which is societies that either think they've modernized or are in the process of modernization in their internal politics. There's a contest between the accelerators, the accelerationists, and people who are portrayed as the reactionaries, an attempt to claim the term as being the one that suits your party, your program, and therefore it's the one that goes with the direction of travel. And that contest, the first story is still happening too in all sorts of ways, Western imperial arrogance imposing modernization. But the critique is very much focused on the 20th century. But that other one, as you say, it still feels like it's all around us. It runs all the way through the history of modern democratic politics, that parties and politicians want to claim the term modernization on the assumption that this thing is happening to us or has happened already. And to have that on your side is to stake a claim to being on the side of the future. And that one, that feels as prevalent now as ever to me. We are talking in the aftermath of an election in the United States, which maybe suggests some of the pitfalls of it, but it's still absolutely present in our politics. Maybe it's not always characterized as a modernization, but staking the claim to being on the side of the direction of travel of technological and other forms of progress is really present now.
I absolutely agree. I think it's deeply present at such a deep level that people aren't necessarily always aware of it. I don't want to conflate modernization with the concept of progress, although the two are obviously deeply connected. But what modernization brings with it that perhaps isn't there with progress is that it's not just about these nice things that we associate with progress, freedom, equality, efficiency, and so forth. It's that those things come from following some set of rules. And so the nation comes to feel like a vehicle, not just a ship of state, but a vehicle traveling through time. And the task of politics is to make sure that it properly and smoothly follows that route that is laid out before it, which is going to generate a very particular conception on the part of governments and politicians about what they're doing, and a way of thinking about politics that is actually quite modern, I would say, because it's not about resolving perennial conflicts or managing the inherent contradictions of collective living. It's about managing a machine the state, the nation, to drive things in certain kinds of ways. But it can also inform deeper and sometimes not entirely incorrect analyses. So there is, for example, in British politics, there is a powerful analysis, particularly associated with the mid-century Marxist left, that what makes England, Britain distinct is that it didn't modernise properly. That because it modernised early, began to develop capitalist markets and expand, because it had a revolution that it then backtracked on and it kept its aristocracy, it never quite got to be modern like France or the nations that unified like Germany or Italy or the brand new ones like America. And then you can analyse British politics, economy and society in that sort of way. You can say, okay, well, what are the things that we didn't get modern? Now, I think you can do some good things there. You can do some useful things. You can say, oh, okay, these are the things that make the UK quite distinct. It has a certain sort of individualism that never quite lost the idea of the aristocratic dandy who's free from the obligations of economic life. You can say, this is why we kept all the pomp and imagery of monarchy, and this has certain effects on the way we understand hierarchy and class, and we have a certain attachment to the gentlemanly life of the financier rather than the hardworking industrialist entrepreneur. And you can make analyses that I think are not necessarily wrong. They're analyses which the idea of modernisation can help, because you're asking not what would make this the same as everywhere else, but you're asking, okay, what is it that makes this different and distinct? What are the things that make this country work in that particular way? But that can very easily turn into, now how do we make it like everything else? And I think there's a way of understanding British politics in that way, even from the right. Stuart Hall, sociologist, cultural thinker, famously called Thatcherism regressive modernisation, seeing it as a strategy to smash some of the institutions that were holding the country back, but doing so while trying to maintain a kind of authoritarian and egalitarian approach. And then Blairism, very, very self-consciously, New Labour conceives itself as a modernising project. Blair talks about, says to the European socialists one time, he says, modernise or die. It's that blunt. But by that point, modernisation has ceased to become a sort of method for analysing and understanding. It's become, what you were describing earlier, a way of making a claim about what has to be done. And if you don't do it, then you are, as Blair also said, one of the forces of conservatism, whether you're a trade unionist on the left or a discriminatory employer on the right, you're all part of the forces of conservatism. And the argument then becomes you have to change just because you have to change. And then weirdly, the modernisation process becomes even more one that denies our agency, because you begin to say things like, it's like the weather, it's a natural process, we can't do anything about it, we just have to adapt to it. And then government becomes a machine for mopping up the stragglers and telling off the laggards for not doing the modern thing.
One of the words that you use there to describe how people conceive of this process is efficiency. And efficiency, I think, is one of the ways in which it sometimes gets cashed out. The way you can tell something is more modern than something else is that it is more efficient. And those 19th century sociologists and early 20th century thinkers who saw this process happening, but it made them very uncomfortable. They saw that the fetishization of efficiency and of a sort of functional view of society, that you work out what things are for and then you make them work better for what it is that they are for. So it's not organic and it's not chaotic. It's streamlined as far as possible. It seems in a way obvious why human beings would be very, very wary of that. And the 19th, early 20th century view of modernization was very wary of it, because you become cogs in the machine. For human beings to be rendered more efficient, if you just think of us, right? We can all become more efficient, right? We're constantly being exhausted. I mean, it relates a bit to the other conversation we had by the wellness industry and the well-being industry to make better use of the hours in our day and so on. But it's not hard to imagine the ways in which that, as a general social program, is pretty alienating. And it is quite odd the way in which a term like efficiency, which for me, just if it's applied to anything other than an actual piece of machinery, is so double-edged, has lost a lot of the negative connotations. It often gets bandied around, and this is certainly true in the 21st century, in the age of the technological revolution that we're living through now, as efficiency good. What happened to the 19th century sense that human beings are inefficient? We just are inefficient creatures. We waste a lot of energy. I mean, everything wastes energy in the end. And to try and make us all efficient, there's something horrifying about it. But I should say, as I say that, I think, God, I sound like a terrible old Tory. I can totally see how then you can be characterised as, that little speech I just gave. Oh, there, as Blair would say, is someone standing in the river with his back to the direction of the current, waving an umbrella in the air and not noticing that the sun is out, or whatever he would say of me.
No, I sympathise with that feeling. That's one of the reasons why I think it's a bad idea, because I've experienced that. Or you can be attacked very easily as someone who is stuck in the past or defending your producer interests, your whatever standing you have or something like that. Or as a conservative who's too attached to the irrational or something like that. So I think the question you ask, how did that happen, is an absolutely crucial question to ask for the analysis of modern politics. That how does the recognition that Europe did something distinct and did something profound in becoming modern and in developing a new way of thinking about itself and thinking about its relationship to nature and using science and technology. That critique, I think we could probably trace it out. It's partly to do with how that gets transported to America and American sociology and becomes aligned to certain conceptions of utilitarianism and becomes aligned above all to ideas about economic management and economic processes and how you need certain institutions that will make economic markets work efficiently. And then that idea of efficiency becomes the one that dominates. So then modernization becomes about no longer having an argument about ends. How should we live? What would be a good life? What would be helpful? And no longer a conversation about messiness, as you say. What are the things we can't sort out, or the difficulties, or maybe there are laggards, but perhaps we should just let them get on with it. That might be okay. And becomes a fixation on the mechanisms and means of efficiency, which then applied to government certainly suits certain kinds of interests, because then it becomes about government not spending too much, not taxing too much. It becomes about government being the servant of the construction of a certain conception of society and involving both its welfare functions, educating and training people to be modern, but also its disciplinary functions, ensuring that people who won't get with the program, as they say, are properly enrolled and understand their obligations within it. And I don't think you understand politics today, and I mean today, right now, this day. You don't understand them if you don't understand that dynamic of how a certain conception of progress turned into the abolition of a debate about ends and became a justification for the exercise of power over people, requiring them to conform, and how rejections of that experience of conformity have now become the province of the anti-moderns, where once upon a time it was the moderns who were critiquing tradition and conformity.
Do you think that it's particularly a temptation for the centre-left, this idea that modernisation, so let's take Blairism as emblematic of this, modernisation and efficiency is the answer to the problem of politics because it allows us to steer a path between revolution. One of the ways in which you can modernise a society is you can blow it up and rebuild it, or you can do that thing of hyper-accelerating the transition through violence and confrontation. And there are lots of different ways it could happen, but revolutionary progress is often done in the name of taking a society from one state and just sort of dragging it, kicking and screaming into the future. And people on the centre-left, particularly after the experiences of the 20th century, tend not to want to do that. But on the other hand, it's a way of distinguishing themselves and pushing back from what they see as what Blair called small c, as well as large c, conservatism. And so this is the way in which you hold the line between the two of them, which is it's not revolutionary modernization, but it's also not reactionary. It is being done in the name of efficiency. And this is thought to be non or post-ideological because, in a sense, who could be against it, right? It's not we're adopting this position because we have this elaborate ideology that we're imposing on you. We are simply telling you how it is. And Blairism was a very successful political project in its own terms. But part of its appeal was in a way to try and say, we are the ones who are going to gently and helpfully steer you along this path. It includes, as you said, globalization and marketization and these things that are happening in a way that we are going to do the humanized version of it. So, the other thing that they're saying is, if you don't put us in power, it'll be in the hands of people who are going to be the really ruthless, brutal efficiency generators. If you want the human version of it, we're your guys. But that feels like a particular centre-left idea of politics. I mean, I guess there's a centre-right version of it too, but it's that idea of politics which is currently actually being squeezed by people who've had enough of it. I mean, that's the point in a way.
Here, then, we're talking about how concepts are used in politics rather than sociology or philosophy. In the latter, we hope they're being used to help you explain things and analyze things and get things right. In politics, concepts are used to help do things. That isn't necessarily bad. They're forms of action, and they're also ways of coordinating and organizing action and ways of orienting yourself politically. So the situation you described there that, say, the UK left finds itself in, or at least part of the UK left finds itself in, is on the one hand, it no longer has faith in the revolutionary transition to socialism. So it's got to find some other way to understand itself and its mission and its purpose. But it retains that idea of progress history, something we understand better than others that we can take people to. And modernisation helps it to do that. So on the one hand, it finds itself looking for a new validation for the state. If the state isn't the vehicle for the expression of the common will of the proletariat or of the people, what is it? Well, it's the machine, the staff that will understand the techniques properly to apply to create modernisation, to reform the British state so that it can be the proper, free, equal, modern liberal democracy it should be. So it serves to justify the state and the state's bureaucracy and its policy actions. But it also, for the new Labour case, it also had to deal with the fact that here's a Labour Party that is now going to make itself committed, as Thatcherism was, to putting working people out of work, to moving beyond the manufacturing economy and embracing the knowledge economy and new forms of work. So how does it explain that to itself? Well, again, it says, oh, no, actually, that's okay. That isn't an abandonment of what our politics and policies used to be. It's just a new and better understanding of how it is that we get to where we want to go for what modernisation is. So, yes, we want people to lose their jobs and retrain as web designers. That's also going to make them freer and more equal, and we'll get away of the old hierarchies. The industries were prejudiced. They were stuck in the past. They were traditionalist. They had traditional divisions of labour. So we're going to get rid of all those and have everyone being free-flowing and self-creating individuals. And then the third thing, though, I think also is the tremendous existential blow that people committed to left politics feel post-Thatcher, post the end of the Cold War. There's a loss of faith there, a loss of faith in the direction that societies and history are taking. And modernisation is a way of, I think, restoring that faith because it gives you a way to check, am I right? Am I going in the right direction? I'm looking to left and right. Yes, if I see that I'm in line with the other progressives, I can tell myself a story that I am pursuing a correct path through history. But all of that is devoid of the things that perhaps 19th century and early 20th century political thinking had, which is, one, a stronger sense of this is a conflictual process. We're trying to achieve something that we think intellectually or morally is a good thing. But also it loses that critical edge that we started with, that sense that sometimes modernisation is better for some people than it is for others, that it's a process that serves and justifies the interests of some over others. And if you remove that from your analysis and your understanding, then you just have this purely process-based conception of change for its own sake, of moving forward for its own sake, of efficiency for its own sake.
Another difference between the sociological account and what might happen to the concept in politics is the sociological account is describing something that happens to a thing called society, a society or societies. And many of those sociologists, historians and others were very aware that it looks really different if you describe it as happening to people, happening to individuals. It's awful. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was a good thing when seen from the perspective of societies as measured by certain criteria and certain social values. But the Industrial Revolution was a horrible, horrible thing to live through for the vast majority of the people who lived through it. Not just the wrench and the upheaval, but just the degradation of it. And also, even if it happens quickly, say it happens over a generation, in sociological terms, you could talk excitedly about transformation taking place within a generation. But if that generation is your life between the ages of 15 and 45, it's not such a great accelerated transformation, right? It's the destruction of your hopes. And this is still a brute fact of politics, that these broad processes that can be described in the round and their benefits seen in the round are experienced not just differently by different people, but it's a horrible experience. It's the difference between saying to a society, modernize, and saying, if you say to an individual person, modernize, I can't think of any context in which that would be a nice thing to hear, right? We're going to modernize you. We're going to come in. Maybe we're going to come into your house and modernize your house. You're going to get better plumbing, but we're going to modernize you. It's from the individual perspective. And this is certainly true of 21st century politics. the ways in which that idea modernization plays out is experienced by many people as a kind of assault, right? And it's so at odds with the language of sleekness, efficiency, progress. It's a violent assault for many people to be modernized.
And an assault that you're not allowed to acknowledge or to state, because if you state it, then you're showing that you are one of the people from the past. If you say, I don't want to change the way that I give my lectures, I don't want to change the ways in which my work functions, well, then you are someone who is holding back change, openness, progress, etc. And we don't like to be reminded, as you say, of the violent processes that forced modernization. It's not just the forced modernization of the Soviet Union involved an awful lot of violence and killing. The modernization of the United States was done through very directed and intentional killing and eradication of people. We don't like to think about that because that's the dark side of modernization that then puts into question that conception of progress. But to come back to contemporary politics, I think that's where it's very difficult for, or rather I want to say there's a contradiction between a conception of politics as hearing those grievances and those concerns and thinking, well, okay, how do we address those? Can we incorporate them? Can we broker some kind of arrangement between the different demands? Or are we going to say, actually, no, tough? There's that conception of politics. And the one which dominates, certainly in parts of the liberal centre and some of the left, is we don't need to hear that, we can't hear that because we have a plan. Or rather, there is a plan and we know how to follow it.
Do you think one of the other temptations of thinking in political terms that the job is to modernize is that at any given moment you have to look around you as a politician and work out what are the modern things here that we're going to hook ourselves onto? So you look at the present scene, to use a sort of 1960s sounding phrase, and try and work out where's the groovy modernization going on. And within a few minutes, that stuff always tends to look a little bit dated already. You know, if you look at the history of British politics and British politicians embracing the white-hot modernization process, they can look quite quaint and outmoded quite quickly. Even with Blairism, some of the cool and groovy stuff doesn't look so cool and groovy quite quickly afterwards. And so modernization, when it becomes a political slogan, actually, weirdly, it lands politicians with such a fetish for the present that they can quite quickly look pretty unimaginative about the future and the direction of travel. And there they are still extolling the virtues of whatever was the latest fad, the latest trend. It's a sort of fashionable way of doing politics. And the thing about fashionable politics is it goes out of fashion very quickly.
Yeah, so I think there what you're getting at is the way in which, or the part of what happens here is the sheer banalization of the concept of modernization. That eventually it doesn't just lose meaning, it comes to mean the most mundane thing it could mean. When would most of us use the term modernization? Well, we might modernize a house or a building. That would be it. So then politics becomes a kind of redecoration project, maybe make the water and energy supply a bit more efficient perhaps, but it becomes that kind of project. So then where does a politician turn? Well, you want the people who are going to tell you how to make your house modern. And that's precisely the fashionable gurus, the interior designers of the state, who will say, yeah, this is what it looks like. And they might say, as for a period under Blairism, they would say, oh, it's creative industries. What you want to do is get some more creative quarters into your cities. That'll do it. That'll make it modern. So then modernization is absolutely getting caught up in ideas of what's fashionable and what looks hip and what looks young and what looks cool. But that's going to be pretty limited, both in its time and certainly in its value for guiding any political project. Or then you get, as again happens in the 90s and 2000s in British politics, is someone's going to say, oh, no, it's the information superhighway, as Blair used to call it in his speeches. And so you either uncritically begin to think, oh, yes, if we just get the computer technology in, that's going to be new and modern and fashionable, and that will make everything great. So you fall prey, the modernizer falls prey to every huckster that comes along and loses critical sense of, well, actually, how much can an economy rest on creating a quarter in each rundown city for artists to live in? Is the internet actually going to be a source of unalloyed freedom and good, or could there be downsides to this? And what are the costs of trying to take everyone out of a job and replace them with a computer or an AI? So I think it becomes a substitute, as I said before, really, for analysing and understanding what's happening at this historical moment, for paying attention to who has power and who is driving what and who is selling you what, and becomes a reassurance that whatever I'm doing is good and right because it's in line, it's in tune with history. And the idea of being in tune with history becomes the only criteria for assessing whether what you're doing is any good or not.
As someone who's just read Tony Blair's latest book, which is called On Leadership, and like everything that Blair produces, a lot of it is really interesting. And I'm sure a lot of it is also actually pretty helpful if you're trying to stand for and win office. He was good at that. But the chapter, I've written about this, the chapter on technology is absolutely extraordinary because it is what you've just described in spades. He has fully signed up to the idea that what's happening in Silicon Valley now is the direction of travel for the foreseeable future. And it is the job of political leaders to embrace it. One of the phrases he uses is, you must let your country become a sandbox for these people to play in, because that's the way in which you can then make sure you will be part. He says it under ethical conditions with restraints in place. But what comes across most strongly is that the thing that he has embraced is the stuff that he's hearing from Silicon Valley now. And using your comparison with interior decoration, in 5 years' time, it's just going to look beige, right? It's going to look like, the thing about, look at interior decoration from the 1990s and tell me if it looks modern or not. It becomes incredibly present-centered. You are speaking through a megaphone the slogans of now. It is a philosophy of now. And as you said, and I really want to ask you about this, it's political forces to try and say this is inevitable and you can't stand in the way of it. But what it produces is a backlash. What it actually tends to produce and to empower are the people who want to stand in the way of it, precisely because it is so present-centered. It's quite easy to ridicule it on the grounds that what you're saying is just something that you heard 5 minutes ago. And it can make the modernizers look like fools. And I think a lot of the backlash against contemporary centrist politics is precisely that. Centrist politics, in trying to be up to date, can be ridiculed as out of date very, very quickly.
I love that idea of political modernization is building the avocado bathroom suites of the future.
And eventually they'll come back into fashion, but by then we'll all be dead.
To get to career point, that's exactly right. The backlash that builds against that. And that backlash builds partly because there are people who are going to be harmed by this process. Just as you said, the industrialization was terrible for many people. The knowledge economy put lots of people out of their jobs. It wasn't as violent as the Industrial Revolution, but it harmed a lot of people's interests. It affected their livelihoods. And if you're not thinking about that and how to bring those people along, you're creating the space for a backlash. You're also not giving people justifications and reasons for the politics that you're bringing, because your justification is you just have to do this. And that's what leaves the space open for a counterculture, as it were, to arise against it. I mean, I would say that's one of the ways to understand what Brexit was. It was the name for a bundled up set of oppositions and resentments for people who lost out from globalization and from the knowledge economy and didn't feel that they had a voice. But also, it's a backlash against the jargon of modernization, all these terms. A sand pit for them to play in. I mean, that's a term for a particular kind of management training class, isn't it? What does that mean to most of us? If it means anything, it's an irritating thing you're occasionally forced to do on a work day. That's not a good way to sell a political policy, it would seem to me, to explain it or to justify it. And that's where I think we can begin then to use this critique of the jargon of modernization as a way to understand some of the things that have happened in recent British history. So people forget that when Cameron came to power in 2010, he appeared to have an ideology before he became the Cameron who perhaps was not entirely focused on day-to-day business of governing and wasn't fully in charge of his brief. He came out with others, Michael Gove and so forth, with a claim to a comprehensive analysis of what had gone wrong with British politics and with what should come after it. And what they called the future wasn't modernisation, it was the post-bureaucratic society. That was the phrase they began to develop and the concept they began to develop, and to say, look, what's got wrong is that society's become dominated by bureaucracies that constrain us, that interfere in our lives, that limit innovation. They could connect it to Thatcherite ideas about free market entrepreneurialism, but also to conservative ideas about the intrusion of the big state, but also could align it, curiously enough, with certain ideas of that we might associate with modernisation of individual liberty and individual self-expression. But what struck me at the time then was also how a certain critique that you might have associated with the 19th century, the Weberians or the Marxists, the critique of the bureaucratization of the modern state, was beginning to be articulated by mainstream politicians. It has a long history in conservative thought, and beginning to take shape as the means for articulating a critique of the Blairite modernisation project that wasn't just Can we go back to having armies parade through the streets? And can we go back to commissionaires at cinemas wearing uniforms? And can we go back to pint glasses with mugs and pound notes? But there was actually mounting something like a serious attempt to critique what modernisation had entailed, a bunch of people employed by the state to tell you how to live your life and get with the times.
What happened to that idea? It collided with a more blunt backlash, right? It actually got associated with the thing it was trying to critique in the end.
Yes, it did. Partly because Cameron tried to keep some of the socially progressive, culturally progressive elements of his politics in play, being a bit green, being relatively critical of discrimination and so forth, and Brexit overtook it. But bear in mind the extent to which Brexit was presented to people in part as a rejection of the bureaucratic class that was getting in the way and telling you how to live your life. And if you read the pamphlet produced under the name of the new Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, that she brought out during her campaign for the leadership, it's pretty explicitly articulating opposition to the bureaucratic society in much more militant terms than we had during the Cameron era, in terms much more influenced by the United States, where they call it the administrative state, and that's what they want to dismantle. As one would expect, the dialectic gives us the opposition to modernisation. It's not simply traditionalisation, but it's a rejection of modernisation born within it that takes the form of a critique of some of those essential propositions of liberal modernity to do with inegalitarian societies, rule of law, and an idea of progress as inevitably good.
The European Union itself was often described by its defenders as well as its critics as the ultimate modernisation project. And that's one of the reasons why it absolutely does fall into this. If you're trying to get beyond the bureaucratic state, the European Union is going to be, I suspect, in your line of fire. And yet those arguments already feel not like avocado bathroom sweets, but they do feel a little last decade in this decade's accelerated arguments about populism and technology and the direction of travel of democratic politics around the world and the pressures that democracies are under. And this is the last question I want to ask you, because I don't know the answer to this, and I've read things that argue it both ways. But in the hyper Silicon Valley conception of the future, where this technology is, the thing that Blair seems to now believe in, this technology is moving at such a pace, AI as the driving force behind this. AI is coming, it's coming for us. This is not just the direction of travel, but this is the future, and it's here now. And you either get on board or you get brushed to the side. And people who are made uncomfortable by that argument, some of them attack it as hyper-modernization. And I've read things that sort of more or less say Silicon Valley is treating us like imperial Western powers treated the places that they colonized. They have this bird's eye modernist view of efficiency and progress that just obliterates cultural difference, obliterates individual experience, and makes us all cogs in the machine. And in the end, the machine will malfunction because the things that it is sweeping up will be grit in the way that it works. And maybe that is what is going on in contemporary politics. The grit is clogging this thing up, but then it's complicated because Elon Musk has just helped get Donald Trump elected. So is Elon Musk on the side of the grit, or is he the person who's constructing the machine? But the other critique of it is that it's actually postmodern. And, without wanting to get into what that term means, but that the idea is that really what you're getting from Silicon Valley is something way beyond that classic modernist view of efficiency and system and function. We're entering a world in which they're embracing chaos and words meaning whatever you want them to mean. A classic definition of the origins of modernity from a philosopher used to talk about a lot. I try and avoid talking about Thomas Hobbes, but he defined, the origins of the modern state as the point where words got fixed meanings. That's the job of sovereign power. Pre-modern, words meant what you felt they would mean, or they meant what your priest told you they should mean. Modernity is agreed meanings out of which you can construct efficient mechanical processes. And what we're getting from Silicon Valley now is the unraveling of that. The words can mean whatever you want them to mean. This is an empowerment of individuals which is exploding ideas of modern efficiency. Both of those lines of attack on Silicon Valley are present. They may both be true. They may neither be true. I'm not sure. Which one do you tend to go with? Are we at the mercy of the hyper-modernizers or the post-modernizers? And I should say some of those Silicon Valley gurus do actually They're more comfortable with kind of postmodern French philosophy than they are with the classic 20th century modernist thought, which to them is hopelessly outmoded. There's a question.
Understanding how and what those people think and how they came to think it is definitely one of the questions of our time. I think the way to begin answering it is to go back to where we started, thinking about the original critiques of modernisation in the 19th century. And of course, what's important about those is Weber, Durkheim, Marx, whoever, they don't want to go back to a pre-modern time. They want to overcome modernisation. They see it as incomplete and there's something better beyond it. We can get through this kind of phase. Now what we have in the present is a paradox in which that critique has been sort of lost by the liberals and the left, or the left has been defeated. And so the critique of modernity is coming from the reactionary side, it seems, the conservatives. But there's a point where reaction becomes so intense and so focused that it becomes revolutionary. And to use my metaphor of modernisation as redesigning the house, it gets to the point where it wants to just knock the house down and start again. And the curious thing that has occurred is that the Silicon Valley people you're talking about have found they have a common interest with all sorts of other people who don't like modernisation and the modern state and liberal progressivism. They want to burn the house down and start over again. And that's where I think some of these Silicon Valley people come in. I wouldn't call them post-modernists. I wouldn't necessarily call them hyper-modernists, but they're definitely revolutionary anti-modernists who want to overcome the present as they see it and its problems. And those problems are primarily what they associate with liberal modernity. But the key thing to understand there is that I would say the fundamental objection to modernity that unites Trump and the Christian nationalists and the libertarians and the Silicon Valley people, the fundamental thing is they don't believe in equality. They are actively inegalitarian. And they want to restore or bring about a world in which inequality is validated again and becomes a key governing principle. And that's where someone like, you were alluding to Peter Thiel, I take it, as one of the Silicon Valley people who was influenced by French philosophy. And Peter Thiel is a strange and fascinating person in many ways, not as great a thinker as some present him as, but is deeply influenced by not so much radical French post-structuralism, but by highly religiously oriented and mystical versions of French philosophy. He wants to bring back the enchantment that is lost by disenchanted modernity, but also bring back the order and stability that he associates with pre-modern order. So there's something about him that combines a kind of what you call a hyper-modernity. It wants to overcome and exceed the present day and make use of new technologies, but in order to restore a political order that was lost with the birth of enlightenment. And that sounds like a very paradoxical thing to claim, but the attempted resolution of that paradox comes from one of the people who Peter Thiel has expressed interest in, which is essentially a blogger called Curtis Yarvin, blogs under the name Mencius Moldbug. J.D. Vance also cites him approvingly. And Moldbug's argument is that we should get back to medieval monarchy, except the monarchs should be the CEOs. So we should run society like a private corporation under the guidance of the excellent, heroic, superlative, better than the rest of us people who understand it. And those are, surprise, surprise, the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. So that's where I think this doesn't resolve the paradoxes, and it isn't, in my view, a coherent political argument at all. But you can see how it comes out of a critique of modernization is we need to get back to some things from the past, but we will do it and achieve it through the means of the present.
The other thing you could say about it's an attack on modernization. It's also part of the backlash. And I think it's part of the backlash because it picks up on the way in which conventional modernizers in the center ground, whatever that is, of politics, can be parodied as trivializing this broad process. And one of the things that you get from the Silicon Valley perspective is an attempt to say their perspective is so narrow. They've got hooked on the idea that modernization is from this year to the next or this decade to the next. We, the visionaries, know that this thing called modernity is just a phase. It's, if you take the real bird's eye view, the universe perspective, the radical long-termism that some of these people embrace, the colonization of Mars, the idea that the human race is going to expand out into the universe, all of that. By those standards, thinking about the billions, the trillions of people who are unborn, the light years that we're going to travel, the cosmic perspective, which makes climate change a trivial problem because in the end, we're going to have to find another planet. From those points of view, modernity, the dramatic transformations from 18th to 19th century, 19th to 20th century are relatively small fry stuff. But what's really small fry is New Labour or whatever it is, that version of modernisation. Yeah, as seen from Mars, who gives a shit? And that is part of the backlash. And I think it is interesting that it has successfully, at least for now, fused with that much more now present day specific backlash from people who are just angry about the ways in which they have been excluded or patronized by this process. It's a really odd, probably potentially unprecedented conjunction. The people who are going to colonize Mars, maybe it's not unprecedented, I don't know. The people who are going to colonize Mars and the people who are feeling this as an assault on their day-to-day lives. But that's the political force that has emerged this year, last year, this decade, last decade, whenever it was.
So to summarise, the clashes between those who want to remodel the bathroom and those who want to build cities on Mars, isn't it? That's the difference here.
Yeah, want to build cities on Mars that won't need bathrooms because we'll have evolved beyond that.
But what you can see there is that part of what in that mythology of building cities on Mars is a mythology of colonial expansion, of westward expansion, of the heroic, unique individual who is going to then lead the rest of us and shape things for the rest of us. So you get, on the one hand, a kind of idea of progress, but without equality. You get an idea of progress that's based on restoring the power of certain kinds of people, men mostly, who are going to be the leaders who are going to found, and they do call themselves founders, of course, in Silicon Valley. They're going to found new things, and they're going to cut through all the problems, and they're going to cut through all the compromises, and they're going to cut through all the jargon, and they're going to cut through all the tedious imposition of efficiency that the modernizers do. But I'm very interested in the way you put that. I hadn't quite thought of that before, that's linked to a kind of cosmic perspective, which is definitely a language you often get, particularly in someone like Peter Thiel, that overcomes the kind of narrow time horizons of the politicians. You're almost certainly not as online as I am. I'm online a lot in reactionary spaces. It's a living. Have you come across the current year meme? Do you know that? So this is a way in which the right, often the very far right, but not just them, make fun of liberalism and everyday liberals with what they call the current year meme. And what they're pointing to is the way in which a certain kind of liberal argument proceeds simply by citing the date. I can't believe you can say that. It's 2024. How can it be that in 2024 people are still blah, blah, blah? And the reactionaries throw this back. Oh, you're going to tell me it's the current year? You're going to current year me? And it's actually quite effective, I think. I don't have any sympathy for these people's politics, but it points out a certain idea of a liberal faith in progress in which things just ought to be better. And if they're not better, well, all you've got to do is assert how they should be better and you're being old-fashioned. But I hadn't really thought about the way in which it also catches on to the fact that that's a very narrow conception of time and history, and that these people are coming at that with a much longer sense of empires rise and fall, civilizations rise and fall. That's part of what I think makes them scary, because even more than the modernizers who don't worry about how horrific the Industrial Revolution was, I think there's people here who don't worry about how horrific it would be if we actually burned the house down.
And I say that conjunction is new, but even as we were talking, I was thinking, of course, it's not new, because as you said, colonizing Mars is a kind of imperial project. And to go back to where we started, late 19th century populist imperialism is a conjunction of these two forces. Cecil Rhodes and people who are experiencing the Industrial Revolution in such a way that they want to ally themselves with certain kinds of politics. That's a potent force. And we've come full circle in some ways, but the difference is the thing that you've just described. It's also bringing in the people who've been playing computer games called Civilization. And actually, by those standards, Cecil Rhodes is just a blip in the current year of history.
Exactly. The bit that gets missed when you embrace the conception of modernization is the recognition of the distinctive practice of politics that is unavoidable, that has to be gone through, dealing with conflicts of interest, working out how to persuade and win people over. And for me, part of what we've been talking about is how a certain kind of liberalism lost sight of that, how the left, which did understand that often, has been broken down or co-opted within that. And in that void is where the kinds of reactionary post-modernization politics that we're talking about have come. And they are very aware of what politics is from their point of view, because like Peter Thiel, they're Schmittians, and politics is about knowing who your enemy is. And if anything comes out of the very current political moment, the election in America, it should be that liberals need to recognize that sometimes politics is about friend and enemy, and they've been targeted as the enemy, and they better start thinking about what to do about that.
A reminder that you can follow us on Blue Sky at PPF Ideas. And also, if you go to our website, ppfideas.com, you can find out, we hope, everything that you might want to know about this podcast, what we've done, and who we are. All of our past episodes are available there too. Coming up on the History of Bad Ideas, we're going to be speaking to a whole host of PPF friends and regulars, including Robert Saunders, Gary Gerstle, Lucia Rubinelli, Chris Lintott. Lots of bad ideas to come. Next up, I'm talking to the historian Aisha Zarakol about all the things that went wrong with the idea of the end of history. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.